Out there on the black edge of the ocean, some lights never go out, and some go dark for reasons no one can explain. Tonight on Haunted Fears, welcome to 7 Most Disturbing True Lighthouse Keeper Horror Stories. Tales from people who lived alone with the sea, the storms, and the things that started watching them back. As you listen, notice how the air around you feels heavier, how every small sound suddenly matters. If you're new here, join the Haunted Fears horror family by subscribing. And if you're already one of us, turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and whatever you do, don't look out the window when the stories begin. Have you ever caught your own reflection doing something you didn't, and wondered which one of you was actually in control? I didn't start questioning that until the night I saw myself standing outside the lantern room in a lightning storm, with my back turned to me. My name is Massimo, and when they moved me out to that Scottish rock, I thought it was a promotion. Fresh air, steady work, proper solitude. I'd done shore duty for a while, checked lights from a distance, watched other men get the remote postings. When the call finally came through that they needed someone young and adaptable on the isle, I said yes before they finished listing the risks. I was tired of other people's rules. Out there, it would just be me, the sea, and the light. The first weeks were mostly routine. The tower was a 19th century stone column, all thick walls and narrow windows, the kind of place you feel more than see. The keeper's cottage huddled next to it, low and squat, its roof constantly peppered by rain and salt. Sheer cliffs fell away on 3 sides, the 4th taken up by a tiny landing where the supply boat came whenever the weather allowed. Most days the wind never stopped. It just changed pitch. People imagine lighthouse work as romantic, but it's mostly maintenance and monotony. Clean the glass, check the fuel, then the backup systems. Walk the stairs until your knees complain. Log everything. Out there, every small job feels bigger because there's no one to hand it off to. I took a kind of pride in that. The stone spiral between the watchroom and the lantern became my treadmill, my church, and, eventually, the place where I started listening too closely to my own thoughts. The first time I saw the figure in the gallery, I assumed it was a trick of the storm. It was one of those nights when the sky seems more water than air. The wind came straight off the Atlantic, dragging the surf up the cliff in sheets that slammed the glass like thrown gravel. Every few seconds, lightning lit the horizon, white veins flickering over black water. I was doing what I always did in that kind of weather, pacing slow loops around the lantern, checking for leaks, listening for anything that wasn't wind, rain, or machinery. The gallery outside the lantern room was a narrow circular walk with an iron rail, just wide enough for a man to move around the tower to clear snow or salt off the glass. In good weather, you could step out there and feel like you were floating above the sea. In a storm, you didn't set foot there unless you wanted the wind to pick you up and decide your fate. I caught the shape in my peripheral vision, a dark vertical smear against the brighter, lightning-washed sky through the glass. I turned, squinting, and the next flash froze everything like a photograph. There was a man standing out on the gallery, his back to me, shoulders hunched against the wind. His coat clung to him like a soaked blanket, collar up, head bowed. The details hit me in slices. The tilt of his head, the way his right hand gripped the rail, the familiar slump of tiring muscles trying to stand straight in bad weather. He was wearing my coat. Not just the same issue, not just similar. It was the exact one hanging on the peg behind me. Same frayed cuff, same missing button near the hem, same faint smear of paint on the left sleeve from a rushed repair job my first week. The lightning blinked out, plunging us back into the flickering yellow of the lantern's glow. I spun around, heart punching at my ribs, and my coat swung gently on its hook behind me, dripping quietly onto the stone floor. When I looked back, the gallery was empty. I told myself it was stress and light combined. Lightning does strange things when you're high up, surrounded by glass. Reflections bounce where they shouldn't. Your brain fills gaps with whatever shape makes sense. I went down to the watchroom, wrote a line in the logbook about the weather, and didn't mention the man. I didn't want that version of me on record yet. The second sighting came a week later, in calmer weather, which somehow made it worse. The sky that night was a deep, dull gray, the kind that hides stars and horizon alike. The wind had dropped, settling into a steady hiss instead of a scream. I was moving slower, lulled by the sameness of it. Footsteps echoing up and down the stone, the regular squeak of my boots where the stairs always stayed damp. I'd left the gallery curtains half drawn to cut the glare on one side of the lantern room. I don't know what made me look up at the glass. Maybe it was a flicker in the corner of my eye, maybe just boredom. But when I did, there he was again. Same coat, same stance, same back turned to me. But this time, there was no lightning to blame. The lantern's light swept slowly across him, catching the outline of his shoulders, the glint of wet iron on the rail. Rain beaded on the outside of the glass in front of him. And for a moment, I had the insane thought that the tower had made another gallery outside the gallery, a double ring of stone and metal, just to give this figure a place to stand. I stepped closer to the glass, pulse throbbing in my neck. His head tilted just slightly, as if he were listening to something far below. My own head tilted in the same way, delayed by a fraction of a second. I tested it, turned my shoulders, shifted my weight. The figure didn't mirror those movements. It held still, locked into that contemplative hunch. "Hey," my voice came out too loud in the confined space. "You shouldn't be out there." The words sounded foolish the second they left my mouth. There was no one else on the island. The supply boat wouldn't be back for days. No one could have come up the ladder, through the locked door, past me on the stairs, and stepped out into that narrow ring of metal without me knowing. The lantern swept again. The light washed the gallery. Empty. I could have left it at that. A tired brain, some reflections, 2 weird moments in bad weather. But something in me doesn't let anomalies go. I started testing the tower like it was lying to me. I checked the exterior door locks twice each evening. I wedged a small piece of thread across the gallery door frame so I'd know if it opened. I wiped condensation in certain patterns on the glass to see where it ran and where it didn't. I watched my own reflection as I walked, looking for anything out of sync. Days blurred. The storms came and went. The sea kept hurling itself at the cliffs. The routine held. But the figure in the gallery didn't stay gone. Sometimes I'd be halfway up the spiral, a mug of tea in hand, when a flash would catch my eye through one of the narrow slit windows. A dark shape moving along the outer balcony, shadowed against the sky. By the time I reached the lantern room, there would be nothing there but wind and rain. Once, I woke in the watchroom chair to the distinct sound of footsteps circling above me. That hollow, echoing tread of boots on stone just 1 floor up. When I rushed up to check, breathing hard, the only footprints on the gallery were the old rusty ones from years of keepers before me. Maybe I could have handled it if it had stayed vague. Shapes, sounds, the kind of eerie you can laugh off in daylight. The problem was, it didn't stay that way. It was about 3 weeks into my stay when the lightning came back. The storm that night felt different. It built slowly, smearing the sky with thick cloud, then hit all at once. The rain came so hard it bounced off the lenses in rattling sheets. The wind slammed into the glass like it wanted in. The thunder rolled across the island in waves. I was already on edge, and the sudden stab of white light seared everything into high contrast. The lantern room, the gallery beyond, the churning sea, and the man. He stood closer this time. Not at the far side of the gallery, but almost directly in front of me, just 1 panel of glass away. His coat hung off him, heavily, dripping, fabric plastered to his arms. His hands gripped the rail on either side of his body, knuckles pale. His head was bowed, chin tucked into his chest. The lightning froze us both. In that split second of suspended time, I noticed every small detail. The tear near the left elbow of the coat, the faint stain on the right cuff from the oil I'd spilled the night before, The way his hair clung in damp strands to the back of his neck, cut the same uneven way mine was. I couldn't see his face, but I knew, with the cold certainty that lives only where logic fails, that if he turned, I would be looking at myself. The light snapped back to its normal cycle. The thunder followed a breath later, shaking the glass. My own heart pounded in my ears. I took a step back, then another until my shoulders hit the opposite wall. "Enough," I said aloud, just to hear something human. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded small, stretched, like it had been left out in the weather too long. The next flash of lightning showed an empty gallery. That was when I stopped writing full details in the logbook. I recorded weather, ship sightings, maintenance. I didn't mention the man. Part of me was afraid that if I gave him words, he'd become real in a way I couldn't undo. Another part worried what it would look like when some inspector came through and read about how the new keeper saw himself walking outside in storms. Sleep became a negotiation instead of a need. I would sit in the watchroom, listening to the wind thread itself through the cracks, waiting for the right kind of thunder that meant a good chance of seeing him again. I started deliberately catching my reflection in the narrow mirrors on the stair landings, watching it from the corner of my eye to see if it ever moved wrong. The tower has its own rhythms, and mine slowly distorted to match them. Meals at odd hours, naps snatched in 20-minute slices, whole nights where the only sounds were the lens turning and the whisper of my own breath. The first time the figure moved different from me, he didn't do much. He just raised his hand. It was evening, no storm, just that flat white Scottish light that makes everything look like it's underwater. I was in the lantern room, polishing a streak off one of the inner panes. I saw him as a shadow first, a darker shape in the already gray world outside. My hand kept moving the cloth in steady circles. Outside, he lifted his right hand slowly away from his side, fingers opening slightly, palm turned toward the sea. I froze. My own hand stayed pressed to the glass. His stayed raised, not a mirror, not a trick of angle, an independent gesture. My throat went dry. "What do you want?" I whispered before I could stop myself. The figure's head tilted just a little, as if he'd heard me through all that stone and glass. The wind picked up, hissing around the rail. In my peripheral vision, my own reflection stared back at me from the glass, eyes wide, skin pale. For a second, I saw 3 versions of myself. The man in here, the one in the glass, and the one outside. When I blinked, there was only one left. Mine. After that, things unraveled faster. I started catching the figure in more ordinary moments. A glimpse in the gallery when I woke from a nap. A shape rounding the curve of the tower just as I turned my head. Once, I saw him below me through one of the stair windows, as if he were walking the exterior spiral of the building, tracing my path on the outside while I climbed within. Always with his back to me. Always just far enough away that I couldn't see his face. I tried rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of optical phenomenon. Reflected light from the lens hitting wet stone, creating a walking shadow. Maybe I was more sleep-deprived than I realized, the isolation chewing at my perception. I counted my hours. I made myself eat properly. I cut back on coffee. The sightings didn't stop. Instead, they changed. The worst part wasn't seeing him. It was knowing what he was about to do before he did it. I was in the watchroom one afternoon, rain ticking lightly against the single pane of glass, when I felt the sudden urge to go up. No reason. Just a strong, irrational certainty that I needed to be on the gallery. At the same time, another sensation rode underneath it, like a lower, darker note under a chord. The thought of stepping out into the wind and not stopping at the rail, letting my body go where the stone dropped away. The intensity of it scared me enough that I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles hurt. I stayed in the watchroom, forcing myself to breathe until the wave passed. When I finally looked up, I saw movement through the little circular window in the door. A figure paced slowly around the gallery, just visible between the raindrops and reflections. Coat flapping, shoulders set. When he reached the spot where the door opened out, he paused and put both hands on the rail. I felt, in my own muscles, the phantom sensation of cold iron under my palms. He leaned forward slightly. So did I, unconsciously in my chair. I caught myself and jerked back. On the gallery, the figure also straightened, as if something had pulled him away from the edge. He resumed walking. I sat very still until he vanished from my line of sight. From then on, every dark impulse I had, every flicker of destructive curiosity, I half expected to see acted out by the man in the gallery. The line between my urges and his actions blurred. Was I anticipating what he would do, or was he provoking feelings I wouldn't otherwise have had? The question lodged in my brain like a splinter. Whose thoughts were whose? I started talking to him. Only at night, only when the storm noise was loud enough that it felt like it could swallow my words. I'd stand in the lantern room, with the curtains half open, and say things like, "You don't get to decide," or, "If you're me, you already know this is a bad idea." I told myself it was just a way to hear a human voice, but some part of me wanted an answer. One night, I got as close to one as I think I ever will. The storm had been building all day, stacking cloud over cloud until the air felt tight in my lungs. By midnight, the thunder was so frequent, it sounded like a rolling drum. Lightning kept throwing the gallery into harsh relief. I'd been awake too long. My hands shook when I wrote the hourly entries. At 2 a.m., the tower felt smaller than usual. The walls pressed in, the stairwell looked steeper. I went up to the lantern room, more to get away from my own thoughts than for any real need to check the light. He was waiting there. No gradual glimpse this time. No half-shadow outside. Just a full, clear view. The man standing almost directly opposite the door, coat-soaked, hair plastered, hands on the rail. His head was bowed, but his posture radiated a tense, coiled energy, like someone leaning into a decision they knew they shouldn't make. Lightning flashed. For a moment, all three of us, the outside figure, my reflection, and my body, lined up. In that instant, the man in the gallery lifted his head. I finally saw his face. It was mine, down to the faint scar near the eyebrow, the tiredness around the eyes, the stubble along the jaw. But there was something wrong in the expression. A slackness at the corners of the mouth, a slight wideness to the eyes that suggested a kind of hollow eagerness. Like I was looking at myself with all the brakes taken off. He smiled. It was small, quick, not meant for anyone else. I felt the echo of that smile tug at my own muscles, as if my face wanted to match it. I fought it, jaw clenched. He lifted one hand from the rail and made a tiny, impatient, beckoning gesture. Come on, then. My heart hammered. The door to the gallery was only a few steps away. I could imagine the feel of the latch, the gust of cold air, the slick stone under my boots. The idea of walking out there didn't feel alien. It felt like something I had already decided to do, and I was just catching up to the decision. Stop, I said, voice shaking. You don't get to choose that for me. The man's expression shifted. For the first time, something like confusion crept into it. His head angled, eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were listening to an unexpected noise. Then, very slowly, he lowered his hand. Lightning flashed again. The gallery was empty. I sank to the floor, back against the nearest wall, breath shallow. The tower swayed minutely under a heavy gust. My hands were cold and damp, and I realized only then that I'd been holding on to the idea of that rail so vividly my fingers had curled in on themselves. I should have called for relief after that. I knew it. There are protocols for when a keeper's mental state becomes a liability. But out there, pride and practicality get tangled. If I admitted I couldn't tell where my own thoughts ended and some ghostly echo began, I'd be done. No more remote postings, no more sea, no more sense of being necessary. So I stayed. I kept the light. I told myself that if the double in the gallery was some part of me trying to step over the line, Then maybe keeping him behind glass was my job too. The sightings grew less frequent after that night, but they never stopped completely. Sometimes I'd see only the hint of a shoulder, the edge of a coat disappearing around the curve. Sometimes I'd feel the pull again, that sudden urge to open a door, to lean too far over a drop, to test exactly how strong the rail really was. On those nights, I stayed in the watchroom. I sat in the chair with my hands flat on my knees and listened to the echo of my own footsteps overhead, even though I wasn't moving. I told myself, over and over, which version of me was real. When my term on the rock finally ended, they came for me on a calm day. The sea was almost gentle for once. The boat felt wrong under my feet after so long with stone. As we pulled away, I looked back at the tower. From the deck, the lantern room was a small glass crown on a gray column. The gallery was a thin line of metal circling it. I told myself not to do it. Then I did it anyway. I raised my hand in a small, quick wave toward the light. For a second, just long enough to convince myself, not long enough to prove anything to anyone else. I saw a dark figure on the gallery lift its hand in perfect time with mine. Maybe it was a trick of distance. Maybe it was exactly what it looked like. Either way, I've learned to be careful around reflections. Out here, away from that rock, I still catch myself in windows sometimes. In the glass of a late-night train, in a storefront, when the street is quiet. Every once in a while, my reflection seems to hesitate a fraction of a second too long before matching my movements. When that happens, I look away first. You can call what I saw on that lighthouse a ghost if it makes you feel better. For me, it was worse than that. It was the part of myself that leans toward the drop, given a shape and a place to stand. And if there's anything I took from those months on the rock, it's this. When you spend enough time alone with the worst version of yourself, you'd better be very sure which one of you is holding the rail. Before you hear this story, ask yourself, would you dare turn the page of a journal that already knows exactly how you die? I didn't, at first. I thought I was just keeping notes, until the logbook started filling itself in faster than I could live what it described. My name is Isaiah, and I'm a marine biologist, not a storyteller. Most of my life has been numbers, water temperatures, salinity readings, migration tracks plotted on screens. When the Institute offered me a funded solo rotation at a converted lighthouse on the Portuguese coast, it sounded like work with a view. 3 months of collecting wave and current data, updating long-term climate models, sending in my reports by satellite uplink. A quiet posting, they called it. Good time to write, to think. Just you and the sea, the director said, half joking. He left out the part about the logbook. The lighthouse itself had been decommissioned decades before and then gutted in the name of modern research. The big classical lens was gone, replaced by a squat, automated beacon on a metal frame outside. Inside, the old keeper's rooms had been turned into labs. Concrete floors, stainless steel tables, humming fridges, a server rack tucked where a bunk used to be. But some things had been left almost as they were, a kind of nostalgic gesture. The stone stairwell, the lantern room, now just an empty glass crown, and the log room. They showed it to me on my first day, more as a curiosity than anything else. A narrow chamber, halfway up the tower, door warped from damp, one small window looking out over the Atlantic. A single metal desk under a flickering fluorescent strip, and on that desk, in the center, lay the logbook. It was thick, hard-bound, leather gone soft with age, edges of the pages browned. When I pulled it toward me, it left a faint track in the dust. The smell that came off it was strong enough to taste. Mildew, old paper, a little like wet rope left in a shed too long. Technically, you can use that if you want, the tech who dropped me off said, shrugging. The old keepers used to write everything in there, weather, ship sightings, whatever. We log digitally now, but some people like tradition. I rested my hand on the cover. The leather was cool, faintly tacky with damp. For a second, I had the stupid impression it warmed under my palm, like skin. "I'll stick to the tablet," I said. He laughed, patted the wall, and left on the boat that afternoon, promising to be back in 2 weeks with supplies. By sunset, I was alone with the hum of the small generator, the occasional beep of sensors, and the constant low thump of distant breakers climbing up through the stone. The first week went as expected. I settled into a rhythm: up with the light, check the offshore buoys on the monitor, log the data, run a quick visual assessment from the old lantern room, lunch from a can or a packet, afternoons processing numbers, evenings with emails, a book, maybe a movie cached on my laptop. The tower had that way of holding sound you only notice when you're by yourself. Your footsteps echo twice. Your cough comes back a heartbeat later from somewhere above. On the 4th day, the tablet froze while I was mid-entry. It wasn't a big crash, just a spinning wheel that refused to go away. I tapped the screen, swore under my breath, tried a restart. Nothing. The log app had decided to pick that moment to brick itself. I had actual ocean data to note: significant wave height spike, a weird blip in the surface temperature on one buoy, and no way to put it into the official record until it rebooted. That was when I remembered the logbook. It felt almost like cheating as I went up to the log room, like I was about to write something sacred in the wrong language. Dust motes swam in the beam of my flashlight. The fluorescent panel above the desk stuttered and buzzed before deciding to stay on. The smell of the place hit me again, stronger now: old paper and a faint sour tang of mold from the walls. I opened the book somewhere in the middle, thumbed through crisp, hand-filled pages. Neat Portuguese cursive I couldn't read flowed across most of them. Dates from the 70s, 80s, 90s, little sketches of waves, of ships, of birds in the margins. Then the handwriting changed. Blockier letters, someone less formal, some notes in English from visiting researchers before me. A few pages near the back were blank. I flattened it open to one of those and uncapped my pen. Day 4, I wrote on the top line: sea state rougher than forecast. Buoy 3 shows anomalous temp spike, surface. Investigate further if persistent. The pen scratched pleasantly on the paper. For all the Institute's talk of data integrity, there was something nice about the physical act of pressing words into a page. I noted the time, the wind direction, a quick sketch of the wave pattern, then closed the book and went back down, satisfied I'd at least kept my own record. By morning, the tablet was working again, and the logbook was, in my mind, already half forgotten, until I opened it again and saw my handwriting where it shouldn't have been. It was small at first. I'd come up to add another note: Day 5 observations, nothing major, and when I flipped to the same blank section, I saw an extra line under my entry. 2030. Generator stuttered twice, reset manual, no further issue. I hadn't written that. I would have remembered. The generator was my lifeline, the sound I fell asleep to every night. A problem with it would have meant stress, sweat, maybe a call in to the mainland. Still, the words were in my blocky print, same ink color, same slight left lean to certain letters. For a long moment, I just stared at the line, mind scrambling for simple answers. Maybe I'd jotted it late at night, half asleep, and forgotten. Maybe I'd been thinking about power checks and my hand had moved on autopilot. I flipped, back through the last few pages. Nothing else out of place. Old entries about storms, Coast Guard inspections, a note about replacing the lantern glass. My single page now had 2 short paragraphs, one that I knew I'd written, and one I was almost sure I hadn't. The generator, for the record, hadn't done anything strange. It hummed steadily when I went back down to check, lights pulsing in their normal slow rhythm. I stood there beside it longer than I needed to, hand resting on the metal casing, waiting for a hiccup that never came. I told myself I'd probably just forgotten a detail. Long days, new place, the constant static noise of the sea. It was enough to fuzz anyone's memory. I decided not to think about it. That worked until the second time. 2 nights later, I slipped going up the exterior stairs. It was nothing dramatic. A slick patch of algae I hadn't scrubbed yet, my boot skidding, my hand grabbing the rail in time. My knee clipped the edge of a step hard enough to bruise, sharp pain that made me hiss, but I caught myself. No blood, no real damage. I cursed, shook it off, finished the climb. The next morning, I went to the log room with a mug of coffee and the lazy intention of catching up on paper notes. The fluorescent light buzzed as usual. The page with my previous entries lay open where I'd left the book. Under day 6, some version of me, had already written, 0735, slipped on outer stairs, impact right knee, no serious injury. My coffee went cold in my hand. This time there was no way to brush it off as a hazy late-night scribble. I hadn't come near the logbook since the last time I'd been in that room. I'd gone to bed with a laptop movie, woken groggy, made breakfast. The slip had happened maybe half an hour earlier. And here it was, described in clean, even letters, time-stamped, waiting for me to read it. The pen lay where I'd left it, uncapped, a tiny dried dot of ink on the tip. The edges of the new line were dry, too, not smudged, not wet, as if it had been there long enough to settle. I did what any good scientist does when confronted with something that doesn't fit. I tried to prove it stupid. I checked the security cameras. There were 3 in the tower, 1 at the base level, 1 in the main lab, and a grainy one outside near the old lantern gallery, mostly for weather observation. None in the log room. There was nothing in the footage but me, moving through my small routines. No one else coming up the stairs. No shadow slipping in when my back was turned. I considered the idea that someone had hacked the place as a joke. But who would spoof handwriting in a physical book they couldn't access, just to make me think I'd predicted a slip on the stairs? It was absurd. For a day, I didn't write anything more. I kept the log on the tablet only, checking the old book's room just once to make sure it was still there, sitting innocently where I'd left it. The air in that chamber always felt a few degrees cooler than the rest of the tower, and the smell of wet paper never seemed to go away, no matter how long I left the door open. On day 7, curiosity won. I decided to run an experiment. If the logbook wanted to write things I hadn't done yet, I would give it the opportunity and see what it did with it. In the late afternoon, I went up with deliberate steps, telling myself it was just to prove how silly this had become. The book opened to my section easily. My last legitimate entry, wave height, wind shift, sat there in my familiar scrawl. Under it, a new heading had appeared overnight. Day 7. The line below was blank, waiting. I took a breath, uncapped the pen, and wrote, R800, normal checks, no anomalies. Then, leaving space, I added 2030, quiet evening, reviewed data sets, no incidents. I dated it, signed my initials the way I always did, then closed the book and went back down. For the rest of the day, I clung to the plan I'd just given myself. I did the standard checks at 8, made a point of having the most uneventful evening I could, even down to what I ate and when I turned off my screens. No extra work, no extra steps by the outer stairs. If the book wanted to predict, it would have to be wrong this time. At 19:45, the generator cut out. It happened mid-email. One moment the laptop glowed. The hum beneath the floor a steady comfort. The next, everything failed at once. Screen dead, overhead lights popping and fading, the constant low vibration of machinery stopping like a held breath. The sudden silence made my ears ring. My first thought was practical. Fuel line, overloaded circuit, something simple. 2 heartbeats later, a darker realization followed. Whatever was happening, it wasn't in that bland line I'd scripted for myself at 2030. Already the future I'd tried to nail down had slipped. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the generator room, the beam cutting through the thick concrete gloom. The air smelled faintly of hot metal. The unit itself sat inert, no telltale blinking on the control panel. I went through the restart procedure step by step, the motions so familiar from training that my hands could have done them alone. Nothing. It took 12 tense minutes, 12 long, sweat-slicked minutes for the thing to finally cough and grind its way back to life. When it did, the light surged on so quickly I flinched. By the time I went back up toward the lab, the moment had already lodged in my chest like a stone. I couldn't just leave it alone. I detoured to the log room. The fluorescent hummed overhead, its light a sickly pale rectangle in the low ceiling. The logbook sat centered on the desk, as before. My section fell open with that faint, papery sound that feels louder in a quiet room. Under my neat, hopeful 2030 quiet evening, reviewed data sets, no incidents. The line had been changed. The words were still mine. Same hand, same ink, but quiet evening had been overwritten in a thicker, darker stroke to read 2030, power failure, generator offline 12 minutes, restart successful, no external cause found. I ran my fingertips over the indentation where the letters had been pressed harder into the page. I could feel both versions of the sentence, like a palimpsest, what I'd wanted and what the book insisted had actually happened. A thought slid into my mind so quickly I almost said it out loud before I could evaluate it. It doesn't record what you plan. It records what will be. Once that idea settled, it didn't leave. After that night, I began checking the logbook first thing every morning before I did anything else. Some days, the space under a new date was blank, and I'd feel a stupid, fleeting relief. Others, there would already be a line or two waiting for me. Small, banal details. 10:15, minor cut left thumb opening crate. 14:10, call dropped mid-uplink. Each time I'd recognize the event a few hours later, as it slotted neatly into my day. It wasn't every moment. It was like the book chose nodes, pivot points where things might branch. And once they were on the page, they happened. A plate I was sure I'd set securely near the edge of the counter slid off anyway and shattered, exactly as described. A comment I told myself I wouldn't make on a tense call to the Institute slipped out halfway through the conversation right on cue. I tried resisting. The first time the log told me 1600, short argument during call with supervisor or a data accuracy, I went into that call with all my edges smoothed. I rehearsed neutral phrases, promised myself to agree with whatever they said. Still, somewhere around minute 10, when he dismissed 3 days of careful buoy readings as sensor noise, my control snapped. Words came out of my mouth in the exact pattern I'd seen in my own cramped handwriting earlier, my tone sharper than I'd intended. After, heart thudding, I stood alone in the lab and replayed the conversation in my head. Every beat matched the line in the book. It was like reading a script you're trapped into performing. Sleep became difficult. I avoided the log room at night, the way you avoid glancing into a dark mirror in an empty house. The idea that there might be a whole day already written for me, the shape of my choices, recorded before I made them, dragged at my thoughts. The first time the book mentioned my death, it did it with the same flat tone as a weather note. I remembered the exact feeling of the paper under my fingers that morning, the slight lift of the page as I turned it. The smell of mildew felt stronger, the air heavier, though I know those are tricks your body plays when your brain is braced for impact. Under the date, 2 days ahead of where I actually was, the entry waited. 2300, fall from lantern room, cervical fracture, fatal. The words were so bald they didn't even feel real. No adjectives, no warning, just a clinical fact in my own hand. I looked up, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway of the log room. The frame was empty. The only sounds were the faint hum of the generator filtering up and the constant distant crash of waves against rock. I read the line again, as if it might change the second time. It didn't. My first reaction was denial so strong, it was almost absurd. I'm not going up there, I told myself. Simple. I won't be in the lantern room at 11 p.m. 2 nights from now. The tower doesn't move on its own. Gravity works the same as always. If I don't climb those stairs, I don't fall. But under the denial, there was something else. A small, cold certainty born from every other time the book had been right. I spent the rest of that day barely leaving the lower levels. I avoided looking up the stairwell, avoided glancing at clocks. When I did go outside to check the sea state, I skirted the base of the tower as if being too near the vertical drop might somehow hasten events. That night, I locked the door to the stairs at 21 Euro and put the key in my pocket. I sat in the lab with a book open and didn't read a word. Every few minutes, my eyes jumped to the digital clock on the far wall. 22:12, 22:34, 22:49. At 22:58, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. 2 minutes. Then it would be 23 bis, then 23:1. If I was still in the chair, still breathing, still not broken on the rocks, the book would be wrong. The spell would break. I stared at the red numbers, like I could force them forward. The lights flickered. It was small, just a quick dim and surge, but in that moment, the tower felt like it shifted under me, a subtle, nauseating lurch. The hum of the generator dipped, then steadied. The clock glitched, the display fuzzing into nonsense, then reassembling itself. 22:59. The colon between minutes and seconds stopped blinking. I stood up before realizing I'd moved. My body acted on its own, stepping toward the door to the stairwell. The key felt heavy and hot in my pocket. There was a tightness in my chest that wasn't quite fear, not exactly. It felt like pressure, like the sensation of a wave lifting you whether you want to ride it or not. No, I told myself. I don't have to do this. I can sit back down. I can wait this out. But another thought whispered under it, in a voice that sounded uncomfortably like my own. You already wrote it. My hand unlocked the door. The hinges groaned when I pulled it open, the sound echoing up and down the stone shaft. Cool air breathed down from above, carrying with it the scent of damp and salt and old dust. Each step climbed itself. That's how it felt. I watched my boots plant and lift, the circle of the stairwell swinging around me. The wall brushed my shoulder on the inside, the rail under my fingertips outside. The tower hummed faintly, vibrations from the generator climbing through its bones. Halfway up, I realized I was counting, not steps, seconds. My lips moved without sound as I ticked off numbers in my head, trying to line them up with time that refused to display properly on my frozen clock downstairs. When I reached the landing just below the lantern room, I paused. The door at the top of the last flight stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. No light from outside bled through. The beacon had shut itself off when they converted the place. Now, on clear nights, only moon and stars offered any illumination up there. I could turn back, I thought. Right now. Sit down on the step, wait until I was sure midnight had come and gone. Lock myself away from that pit described in my own handwriting. Instead, I pushed the door open. The lantern room was a hollow shell, glass on all sides, empty where the great lens had once turned. The floor was stone, worn smooth in a ring around the center. Night pressed close on the other side of the panes, thick and black. The distant sound of the Atlantic came up here thinner, a constant restless shush. I stepped in on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The edge of the room was a low barrier of stone topped by metal, more suggestion of a wall than a real safety measure. Beyond it, the drop fell away, straight to the rocks, and somewhere below, the old wave-cut platform where keepers used to stand watch. There was just enough reflection in the glass that I could see my own pale face, ghosted over the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. I stood in the center of the ring, breathing carefully, waiting for some shove from behind, some crack underfoot, some external force to justify the words in the log. No shove came. What came instead was a thought, calm, perfectly formed, dropping into my mind like ink into water. If you jump now, at least you'll be the one choosing. My stomach flipped. The idea was so clear, so detailed, that I could feel the imagined sensation of my body tipping, the rush of air, the brief, weightless second before impact. It felt scripted, familiar, like I was replaying a memory I hadn't made yet. I backed away, until my shoulders hit the cold central column. My palms were slick. The room seemed to tilt, not physically, but in my perception, the edge of the floor pulling at my focus like a magnet. I squeezed my eyes shut. "I'm not doing it," I said. My voice shook, but the words were solid enough. "You don't get to decide that." I don't know who I was talking to. The logbook, the tower, myself. For a while, I stayed there, pressed to the stone, breathing. Eventually, my heart slowed. The pull toward the edge lessened, became just another bad idea among many. My knees ached, my back hurt. I turned and left, climbing back down the stairs carefully, one hand on the rail. I did not fall. Downstairs, the digital clock had resumed its normal blink. 23:11. The colon flicked on and off, indifferent. I went straight to the log room. The fluorescent light took 3 tries to catch, stuttering, then buzzing to life. The book waited where I had left it. When I opened it to that day's page, my eyes went straight to the line that had been haunting me. 2300. Fall from lantern room, cervical fracture, fatal. The words weren't there anymore. In their place, in the same spot, was a new sentence, written so heavily the paper crinkled around it. 2300. Subject approaches lantern edge, does not jump. Underneath, in smaller letters squeezed into the margin, another line had been added. Final outcome adjusted. Subsequent concealment likely. The pen lay exactly where I'd last set it down, dry tip pointing toward the middle of the page. For a long minute, all I could do was stare. The sense of something watching me, through time, through the space of unwritten days, was so strong I found myself glancing over my shoulder toward the empty doorway. Concealment, I read aloud, barely a whisper. What does that mean? I flipped ahead, pages rustling, half expecting to find my future unspooling in a neat series of entries. Most of what followed was still blank. Here and there, dates further on held a line or two in my hand, mundane notes that made my chest hurt. Transfer complete. New personnel arrive. Equipment updated. On the last page, currently marked with anything at all, the writing changed. The letters were still mine, but they'd been dragged across the paper, as if by a shaking hand. Final entry. Incident contained. Official report modified. Cause, accidental fall. There was no date, no time. Just that flat verdict. I closed the book gently, as if roughness might make it jump ahead and add the missing details. It hit me then, in a way it hadn't before, what the worst part of this might be. Not that the logbook recorded what would happen. Not even that it tried to steer me towards certain outcomes. The worst part was the hint that, whatever I did, the record could be edited, bent to a story that would be told to other people later. The idea lodged in my mind like a nail. Maybe the book hadn't just been predicting keepers' lives all these years. Maybe it had been quietly rewriting their deaths too. I decided that night to leave as soon as I could. Officially, there was no emergency. I could say the equipment was acting up, that the isolation wasn't agreeing with me, that I needed relief. Unofficially, I couldn't stand another morning of opening old paper and seeing my day written there, ahead of me, in my own analyst handwriting. The next supply window was 3 days away. 3 more dawns, with that room overhead, with the smell of mildew and salt threaded through my sleep. I didn't go back to the logbook in that time. I forced myself to log digitally only, to treat the tower like any other remote station I'd worked on. But every time I passed the landing that led to the log room, my feet slowed. The air there felt denser, like the weight of uncounted entries pressed out through the door. On the morning the boat was due, fog rolled in thick off the Atlantic. I could hear the engines before I saw the hull, low and steady beyond the gray curtain. I packed my bag in a rush, double-checked the server transfer, left detailed digital notes for whoever came after me. As I passed the door to the log room one last time, I stopped. Leaving it unaddressed felt like leaving a loaded gun on a table where someone else would eventually sit down. Maybe they'd be fine. Maybe they'd pick it up the wrong way. I wasn't sure which thought bothered me more. I pushed the door open. The room smelled exactly the same. Mildew, old paper, faint ink. The fluorescent flickered twice, then glowed. The logbook sat on the desk, slightly more swollen from the damp than before. I opened it to my section, braced for fresh lines. There were none. My last entry was still that terse, unnerving. Final entry. Incident contained. Official report modified. Cause, accidental fall. I thought about tearing the pages out, burning the book, tossing it into the sea where it could become some drowned thing's problem instead of mine. But even as the images formed, I saw in my mind a future entry in some other hand. Logbook lost in accident. Cause, negligence. The story would bend to fit whatever happened. Maybe worse, the act of trying to destroy it might become the very thing it recorded. In the end, I did the only thing that felt honest. On the line below that last sentence, in the smallest letters I could manage and still be legible, I wrote, "Reader, you can put this down." My hand shook as I did it. When I was done, I closed the cover, turned off the light, and left the room without looking back. On the boat, as the lighthouse shrank into the fog behind us, I told the man at the wheel that the posting had been fine. Quiet. Good data. I didn't mention the book. If I brought it up, I knew how it would sound, and I could almost see the way that conversation might end up logged. Subject reassigned. Concerns about mental state noted. I've tried since then to keep my records digital. It feels safer somehow. Like the past is more fixed when it's in pixels instead of ink. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm drafting reports and my hand aches from typing, I catch myself reaching for a notebook, for a pen. There's a part of me that misses the weight of a physical page, the way words bite into it permanently. And every time I open a fresh journal now, a stupid piece of me hesitates for just a heartbeat, wondering if my name is already there somewhere near the end, dated on a day I haven't reached yet, in handwriting that looks a lot like mine. Out on an offshore tower with nothing but metal and sea around you, what do you do when a dead channel starts calling you by name? Out here, when the water and the sky are the same color and the nearest person is a helicopter ride away, you start to wonder if the voice on the radio is real, or if the platform itself has finally learned how to talk. My name is Joe, and for a while, my whole world was a steel box in the North Sea. They call it a lighthouse, but it feels more like an oil rig that never got the rest of its body built. A single platform on fat metal legs, anchored in gray water so deep I never saw the bottom, with a skeletal tower bolted on top for the light and antennas. No land in sight, just rolling waves and the permanent overcast that turns day into a softer version of night. We got there by helicopter, strapped into orange suits, the mainland shrinking to a smudge behind us until it was nothing. Officially, I was a technician keeper, part of a two-person rotation. 12-hour shifts each, swapping days and nights every week. One of us always on the duty desk in the control room, the other allowed to sleep, watch movies, wander the maintenance decks, pretend life was normal. The light ran itself. The computers watched everything. Our job was to be there if anything failed and to talk to the people on shore enough that they didn't forget we existed. The first time the voice said my name, I thought it was a joke. By then, I'd already been on the platform long enough to learn its sounds, the constant low hum of the generators under the floor, a kind of mechanical heartbeat, the metallic clangs when a wave hit the legs just right, and the whole structure rang like a bell, the deep, distant bellow of ship foghorns in bad weather, vibrating up through the walls. And at the center of it all, the soft, steady hiss of the radios on their watch frequencies, waiting. We were only supposed to touch one of those channels in a real emergency, the international distress frequency. Most of the time, it sat there empty, a line on the console, a green LED that never moved. The manuals drilled it into our heads. Never tie it up, never use it casually, never treat it like your personal walkie-talkie. If you heard something there, you took it seriously. It was the middle of a graveyard shift, sometime around 3 in the morning. when the stillness got to me enough that I started flipping through the non-critical channels, just to hear other human voices. Fishing boats in Norwegian I couldn't understand. A curt exchange between a cargo ship and a coastal station. Static. Always lots of static. My partner was asleep in his cabin below, his door shut. The only light in the control room came from the glow of the screens and the green radiance of the radio dials. Outside, fog pressed against the portholes so thick the security cameras showed nothing but gray. I just clicked past the distress frequency when I heard it. Oi, Joe. The sound was so faint I almost thought it was my own name echoing in my head after too many hours awake. A thin, high voice buried in white noise, like it was a long way off and fighting to get through. I froze, hand hovering over the switch. The channel indicator sat squarely on the emergency band. Say again, I asked automatically, professional training taking over. This is platform light station receiving on 16. Vessel calling, state your position. More static, popping and hissing. I leaned closer, the tiny speaker crackling an inch from my ear. Joe. I can't see the light. The hairs on my arms rose. The voice sounded young. Not toddler young, but not adult either. Somewhere in that uncertain space where the pitch is still high and the words blur at the edges. I glanced at the panel. No distress alert flag, no digital ID tag, nothing. Just that weak, leaking sound. Vessel, repeat, I said more sharply. Give me your coordinates. What is your situation? Silence. The kind of heavy, absolute break that makes you realize how much noise there really is under normal circumstances. The static didn't even whisper. The green LED glowed steadily, innocent. I checked the recording indicator. The system should have been logging everything, a rolling buffer of audio for later review, like a dash cam for the sea. It blinked as usual, but when I played back the last 30 seconds, all I heard was the sound of my own voice addressing empty air. No Joe, no can't see the light, just me talking to no one. I sat there for a long time after that, listening. The channel stayed dead. By the time my shift ended, I'd convinced myself it had to be some weird propagation issue. Radio waves bounce in strange ways over cold water. Maybe I'd caught the tail end of a distant conversation, and my name had just sounded like what I was expecting to hear. The human brain is great at finding patterns, especially at 3 in the morning when you're alone and exhausted. I told myself that, but I still didn't mention it at breakfast. Days blurred on the platform. Shift change, coffee, checklists, weather reports, maintenance rounds, the same footsteps on the same metal corridors, the same view of endless gray through the same narrow windows. We'd stand at the rail sometimes, the metal cold even through gloves, and watch waves roll under the legs, the horizon a perfect flat line. The second time the voice came through, the weather had turned ugly. Wind drove the sea into chopped, angry peaks. Spray reached the lower catwalks in gusts that slapped the walls hard enough to make the fixtures rattle. The foghorn sounded at regular intervals, a deep, mournful note that you felt in your ribcage. Helicopters were grounded until further notice. The onshore coordinator had signed off with a dry, "Don't break anything important." I was on day shift that time, which somehow made it worse. Night messes, with your head, but daylight is supposed to be safe. I was in the control room, logging a routine equipment check, when the distress channel hissed awake without me touching it. Joe. The voice cut across every other sound, higher this time, more urgent. It rode in on a burst of noise like it had punched through some barrier and then gotten shoved back again. I startled so hard I knocked my pen to the floor. It rolled under the console. I didn't bother to retrieve it. "This is Light Station," I said, heart thudding. "Identify yourself. Mayday in progress. State your position." Static. Then, "It's so dark. Why did you turn it off?" My mouth went dry. "The light is operational," I said, forcing the words out slowly. "Beacon is active. We have full power. If you're near this platform, you should see it. Give me your bearing." The radar screen showed nothing smaller than a cargo carrier within 10 miles. No AIS blip for a small boat. Visibility was bad, but not zero. There was no reason for anyone close by to be blind. No answer came. The channel went back to its low, meaningless hiss. I replayed the buffer. Once again, only my own side of the conversation was there. I told myself I'd bring it up with my partner, but when he came up at shift change, yawning and rubbing sleep from his eyes, the words died on my tongue. How was I supposed to phrase it? Hey, you know the dead channel no one's supposed to use unless they're drowning. It's got a kid on it who knows my name, but only when you aren't here. Instead, I asked if he'd noticed any interference. He shrugged, said the gear was old, said the sea played tricks. We drank coffee. We talked about a soccer match we weren't going to see, and the subject slid away like everything else that wasn't in the checklist. After that, the pattern settled in. The voice never called when someone else was awake in the control room. It never spoke over other people. It slipped into the gaps, late at night, or in the half hour after shift change when the off-duty guy had just gone to bed and the on-duty one hadn't quite settled into the chair yet. It never gave a call sign, never a position, always my name. Sometimes it sounded like it was in pain. Sometimes it sounded almost annoyed. Why won't you answer me? It crackled once, the words stretched thin with distance. You're right there. I tried everything technical I could think of. I logged times, weather conditions, signal strengths. I ran diagnostics on the radio stack. I swapped headsets, grounding cables, power feeds. Nothing showed up. The equipment behaved like a model student whenever anyone else was watching. On shore, the coordinator's voice stayed the same level of bored whenever we checked in. No anomalous transmissions on their end. No ghost calls reported. They humored me enough to scan nearby traffic for unofficial chatter. There was nothing that matched. I started, leaving the recorder running constantly on a secondary device I'd brought with me, a little handheld audio unit I'd been using to make notes. I'd click it on, set it near the radio, and let it capture hours of empty hiss just in case. When I played the files back, they were clean. My questions to the ether, the static, the normal ship traffic when I flicked away from the distress band. Never the voice. The more it happened, the more it felt personal. That's what got into my head. More than the mystery itself. It wasn't just random words. It wasn't generic help or generic panic. It was the use of my name, again and again, in that same thin tone. Joe, why are you ignoring me? The first time it asked that, I snapped. Because you won't tell me where you are, I shot back, knuckles white on the mic. Because I can't help you if you won't give me anything. Because every time you talk to me, the tape plays it back like I've lost my mind and been talking to myself. Silence. For a moment, I thought that was it. That I'd finally scared the ghost, or hallucination, or whatever it was away. Then the voice came back, quieter. Closer somehow. Like it had moved from the far end of the ocean to just outside the wall. I'm right here, it said. You just have to come out. The maintenance deck ran around the outside of the platform like a balcony, a steel walkway with a railing, open to the sea. In good weather, you could stand there and feel like you were floating. In bad weather, you stayed away, unless you wanted to be peeled off the grating by a wave. That night, I could hear the water slamming against the legs, sending shivers up through the whole structure. I stood up without meaning to, headset cable going taut. Where? I asked. Come out, it repeated, almost sing-song this time. I can't see you when you're hiding in there. My skin crawled. I pulled the headset off and set it on the console. The speaker still hissed softly. I could have left it at that. I should have. Instead, I walked to the door that led to the outer walkway. The sound of the platform changed the moment I cracked it open. Inside, you lived in the belly of a machine. Hums, fans, electronics, the subtle rush of air through ducts. Outside, the sea owned the soundscape. Wind slapped at the metal skin. The air tasted like salt and cold iron. The foghorn's vibration climbed straight into my chest. The maintenance deck was empty, as it always was. Just railings, grates slick with fine spray, and the tower legs disappearing into churning gray below. I stepped out, the steel shuddering faintly under my boots. "Okay," I called into the wind, feeling stupid and angry at myself. "I'm out." "Now what?" No answer. The only reply was the rumble of a distant swell hitting the supports. For a second, something moved at the edge of my vision. A shape, lower than a man, hugging the far side of one of the legs. I turned my head sharply. There was nothing there but a sheet of water sliding back into the sea. The radio in the control room crackled. I heard it through the open door, my own name carried faintly on that burst of sound. "Joe?" I went back inside, slammed the door, thumbed the lock with more force than necessary. The headset lay where I'd left it. I put it back on with hands that weren't entirely steady. The channel was quiet. The weeks blurred. Sleep came in fits. I got jumpy enough that my partner started noticing. "You look like hell," he said one morning over instant oatmeal. "You're hearing things in the static, aren't you?" It was half joke, half test. I didn't laugh. "Have you heard anything weird on 1-6? I asked. He frowned. "No." "Why?" I watched his face carefully for any flicker of recognition, any sign he was withholding. There was nothing but concern edged with the beginning of annoyance. "Nothing," I said. "Forget it." I didn't tell him how I'd started anticipating the calls, how, at certain times of night, I'd find myself leaning toward the radio before it even hissed. How sometimes, when the voice spoke, it sounded less like a stranger and more like a memory of myself from a long time ago, warped by distance. "It's so dark," it would say. "You turned it off." We hadn't turned anything off. The beacon on the tower burned steadily, a white pulse over gray. The backup systems were all green. But the phrase got under my skin. The forecast shifted toward worse. A major storm was rolling in, the kind that grounds choppers for days. Onshore sent out their last pre-storm update, told us to hunker down, double-check everything, and be ready to ride it out alone. The day the front hit, the sea went from restless to violent. Waves slapped the legs hard enough that the impact boomed through the platform. The sky turned the color of old lead. Rain streaked horizontally. Inside, the lights flickered now and then as the generators worked harder. My partner and I split the storm shifts. He took the first long watch. I took the second. By the time I stepped into the control room for my turn, my head ached from bad sleep and old fear. The radios hissed. The green dials glowed. The distress channel sat there, quiet and waiting. I told myself I wouldn't touch it. If something real came in, the alarms would trigger. I could spend the whole shift pretending that one little band didn't exist. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time stretched weird during storms. Everything outside was the same shade of moving gray. At some point, without deciding to, I flicked my thumb over to the emergency channel. "Joe." This time, the voice sounded relieved, like someone meeting you in a crowd after almost giving up. "I knew you'd be there," it said. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" "You know me." The words came wrapped in static, but the cadence was familiar. A little hesitant, like a kid trying to sound brave on a phone call. "No," I said. "I don't. Give me a name, a boat, anything." Silence pressed in. Then, "It's so cold out here." A part of me detached, observing, noting that the phrasing had shifted from complaints about the light to simple statements about its own condition. Another part of me just felt a hot, useless anger. "You're not out there," I said. "If you were, someone else would have heard you by now. You're in here, in my head, or in this box of junk, or in whatever passes for the soul of this place. Either way, you're not drowning in the dark ocean, so stop pretending you are." Static roared for a heartbeat, like I'd gotten too close to some invisible truth. When the voice came back, it had changed. "Come outside," it whispered. "If you stand at the rail, I can reach you. I can see you then." Something in the way it said, "Reach," made my skin crawl. I thought of the distance between the maintenance deck and the water, the sheer drop, the way waves clawed at the legs like fingers. "No," I said quietly. "You have to," it insisted, in a tone that reminded me unpleasantly of myself when I was a stubborn teenager. "You already did." Those 3 words knocked the air out of my lungs. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You already did," it repeated. "You opened the door. You walked out. You leaned over. I talked to you. You fell. It was so fast." For a second, the control room tilted. The memory it described wasn't real. I was sitting right there, breathing, the chair under me solid. But some part of me recognized the sensation, the hollow lurch of weightlessness, the impact that never came. "I'm still here," I said. "Not yet," the voice said. "But you will be. I'm just ahead of you." The phrase reminded me, uncomfortably, of something I'd heard once about time delays in communication, about how signals from a distant spacecraft are technically from the past by the time we hear them. Listening to ghosts from minutes ago. "What are you?" I whispered. The radio popped. For a heartbeat beneath the distortion, I heard another sound, not words, but a low mechanical grind, like the structure itself was moving. "Come outside," the voice said again, and this time it sounded thinner, fainter, like it was being stretched. The wind chose that moment to slam into the platform hard enough that the walls shuddered. A loose cable somewhere clanged against metal. The foghorn bellowed, a long, desperate note that vibrated up through my bones. I stood up. My legs felt distant but functional. The door to the outer deck seemed closer than usual. "You don't have to be alone out here," the voice added softly. "We can keep each other company. No more silence, just us." Something in that offer, in that use of "we," snapped me back. I thought of the logbooks back on shore, the incident reports, the way stories like "Keeper Lost," "Overboard" during heavy weather were written in flat lines that didn't mention voices or ghosts or time echoes. I thought of my partner waking up to an empty bunk and a silent radio. I thought of my parents, somewhere far inland, getting a call they'd always half expected once I took this job. I reached out and turned the radio off. The click was louder than it should have been. The sudden absence of static made the rest of the sounds on the platform jump into sharp clarity. The generator's hum, the wind's howl, the distant crash of waves. For a moment, I expected the voice to cut through anyway, to find another path. It didn't. The channel stayed dead. I left it that way for the rest of the storm. When the weather finally broke days later and the helicopter came, the pilot joked about how quiet we must have had it out there. My partner rolled his eyes and talked about the wind. I laughed in the right places. I didn't mention that, in the worst of it, the quiet had been exactly what scared me. On shore, during debrief, they asked if we'd had any unusual events. I hesitated for half a second, then shook my head. "Nothing out of spec," I said. "Just the usual noise." The thing is, noise isn't always the problem. Sometimes it's what you hear clearly inside it. I still work around radios. It's hard to avoid them in this line of work. Whenever I hear a burst of static that isn't attached to anything obvious, my chest tightens for a heartbeat. When someone says my name over a headset, part of me listens for another thinner voice layered underneath. So far, it hasn't come back. But on certain nights, when I can't sleep and the house is too quiet, I find myself turning on an old shortwave receiver I keep on a shelf. I'll spin the dial through hissing bands of nothing, through faraway stations and coded beeps, listening. Every time I stop on the emergency frequency, just for a second, there's a moment where I almost expect to hear it again. Joe. I can't see the light. And every time, no matter how strong the temptation to answer, I switch it off before the silence can break. Some jobs feel crowded even when you're the only one on the schedule. Out on that New Zealand rock, it took me a week to accept that the station really did only have one official keeper on paper, and a lot longer to accept that it didn't feel that way inside the cottage. My name is Trenton, and I was never supposed to be more than a temporary fix. They sent me out as a replacement keeper, a stand-in to cover for a man I'd never met while he took the medical leave. That's how they framed it. Just a month, they said. Simple light, automated. You'll mostly be there in case something glitches. The supply boat dropped me on a crooked wooden jetty, handed down my duffel, and pulled away with a wave that felt too casual for what it meant. 30 days alone with a tower and the weather. The island was small enough that you could cross it in 10 minutes, but it felt bigger because of the emptiness. Seabirds shouted overhead, circling and spiraling, then settled on rusted fuel drums and half-buried equipment that looked like it had been forgotten a generation ago. Grass had swallowed old paths, leaving one narrow, well-worn track between the cottage and the lighthouse. Every time the wind changed, the place found a new way to creak. The first thing that bothered me was the boots. Inside the cottage, near the door, 2 pairs of work boots sat side by side on a rubber mat. One pair was mine, fresh issued, soles still too clean. The other pair looked broken in, salt-whitened around the laces, toes scuffed. My size exactly. I didn't think much of it at first. People leave things behind on postings all the time. Maybe the regular keeper had meant to come back for them and never did. Then I unlocked the bedroom. There was only supposed to be 1 made-up bunk. That's the standard. 1 keeper, 1 bed, 1 small chest of drawers. What I found was more lived in. 2 pillows, 1 slightly flatter than the other. 2 sets of folded clothes on the chair. An extra jacket hanging on the hook by the window, the shoulders worn in a way that suggested years, not months. On the desk sat a mug with a ring of dried coffee clinging to the inside. Beside it, a half-finished crossword puzzle, pen laid neatly across it, as if someone had just stepped away. Guess they rushed you out, I muttered, more to break the silence than anything. The instructions had said nothing about overlapping, nothing about meeting the man I was replacing. No handover, no joint shift. Just arrive on this date, boat leaves at this time, do the checks, call in twice a day. According to the paperwork, he was already off roster. But the room didn't look like a place someone had properly signed off from. It looked like a place someone had left in the middle of a day, intending to be right back. I told myself the office just hadn't arranged a cleanup. Remote stations get messy. We all know that. The first night, the cottage walls showed me exactly how thin they really were. The wind slid around the corners, whistling through gaps. The old fridge kicked on with a metallic cough that echoed into the bedroom. The seabirds didn't seem to sleep. Their cries carried in like faint, broken words. Every noise sounded like footsteps somewhere else in the building. I woke up 3 times, certain I'd heard someone walk down the short hall and pause outside my door. Each time, when I sat up and listened, it was just the wind pressing against the structure in a new way, making the boards flex, nails complain. By morning, I'd decided I was just adjusting. New place, new sounds. Day routine helped. The lighthouse itself was a short walk up the path. A white cylinder on a rocky rise with the sea on 3 sides. Inside, everything was standard. Ladder up to the lantern, service panels, backup generator test buttons, the quiet rotation of the optic doing its steady job. I checked what I was supposed to check, logged what I was supposed to log, and for a while I let the work keep me between my ears. The official logbook sat in a little alcove between the tower and the cottage, where the original keepers would have had quick access from both buildings. Thick binding, lined pages, each day marked with neat times and notes. The last entry in the previous keeper's hand had been 3 days before I arrived. 1800. Routine. Light nominal. Weather clear. Under that, a thin line, then nothing. I ran my pen across the next blank space and wrote my name, the date, the condition of the light. My handwriting looked unfamiliar to me in that book, like I'd intruded into someone else's narrative. I didn't notice the other handwriting until a few days later. It was evening, the kind of cold coastal twilight, where the sky goes flat and the ocean turns to dull metal. I was at the little table in the cottage, cleaning a lantern, when I saw movement outside the window. Just a quick flash of shape on the path. A person, unmistakably. Height, shoulders, the swing of an arm. A man in a dark jacket, heading from the tower toward the cottage. My brain slotted it in instantly. My partner, my relief, the other guy coming in from his shift. Then I remembered there was no other guy. The boat wouldn't be back for weeks. There was no one else on the roster. I stood up so fast the chair scraped. The motion startled the shape. It flinched, half-turned. For a heartbeat framed by the window, I saw myself. Not clearly enough to swear in court, no face, no direct eye contact. But the build, the way the shoulders rolled slightly forward, under weight. The exact same style of issued jacket, down to a pale scuff on the left sleeve where I'd knocked it that morning on the generator housing. It was like watching a slightly delayed replay of my own walk. Then it was gone. By the time I yanked the door open and stepped out, the path was empty. Just seabirds, wheeling, and the smell of wet grass. I walked up to the tower anyway, boots thudding on the packed dirt. The door was shut. The lock was latched the way I'd left it. Inside, the air still held the faint smell of oil and salt, and my own sweat. No second set of footprints on the dust near the wall. No extra mug on the little shelf. On the way back, I checked the ground carefully. The only prints on the path were a messy overlay of my own from the day. Sleep, I told myself. You need more of it. That night, the footsteps in the cottage sounded even more like a second person. They paced the hall while I lay awake, counting each creak. Stopped outside my door, went to the kitchen, came back. A couple of times, I heard what could have been the couch springs exhale as if someone sat down there, then stood up again. I held myself still under the blanket, breathing slowly. It's amazing what you can convince yourself is imagination when the alternative feels too complicated to explain. The logbook forced the issue. On the 7th morning, I opened it to add my usual lines. A gull cried outside, its call dragging across the sky like a rusty hinge. The page was not as I'd left it. Under my last entry, in a tidy different hand, someone had already written a line. Orso 30. Walked perimeter. All secure. I stared at it, heartbeat thick in my ears. I do walk the perimeter. It's part of the routine, but I do it at dawn or dusk, not in the dead middle of the night. At 2:30 that morning, I'd been in bed, very much awake, very much not outside. The handwriting wasn't mine. The letters leaned a different way, neat little hooks on the ends of strokes where I made straight lines. Still familiar somehow, like a cousin of my hand. For a long time I did nothing, just listened to the distant boom of waves on rock and the small, close sounds of the cottage. Refrigerator hum. Occasional click as the walls adjusted to the sun. Eventually, I added my own entry under it, pretending the other line was some older note I'd missed. 0800. Light functioning. Visibility moderate. No issues. My pen felt heavier than it should have. After that, I started seeing him more. A figure at the edge of my vision rounding the base of the tower. A form crossing the gap between cottage and outbuilding while I stood in the doorway. Always in the same jacket and boots. Always moving with a gait so close to mine my muscles responded like I'd just walked that path. Once, coming up from the shoreline, I saw him standing on the rise by the lighthouse, back to me. I opened my mouth to call out, voice half forming the generic, "Hey," you use when you're not sure of a name. He turned slightly, like he'd heard me, then walked out of sight around the tower. When I reached that spot 15 seconds later, no one was there. Inside, things rearranged themselves. A cup I knew I'd left in the sink appeared rinsed and upside down on the rack. A chair at the kitchen table stood pulled out when I could swear I'd pushed all of them in. A jacket, my spare, the one I didn't like as much, moved from the peg by the back door to the one near the front. Small adjustments that could always be chalked up to forgetfulness if I tried hard enough. The logbook no longer let me. More entries appeared in that second hand. Not every day. just enough to make it impossible to ignore. 2100, checked lamp glass, no cracks. 500, noted seabird nest near generator shed, left undisturbed. Tasks I might have done, should have done. Some I distinctly remembered not doing at those times. I started leaving subtle traps. A pencil balanced on the logbook so it would roll if anyone touched it. A strand of thread across the hall at knee height. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would catch a real intruder. Just little indicators. Sometimes the pencil had shifted by morning. The thread was brushed aside. No door locks were changed, no windows forced. The island had no hiding spots big enough for a person that I hadn't already inspected. At some point, it's hard to say exactly when, the question in my mind flipped. It stopped being, is there someone else here, and became, am I the someone else? Think about it. There's a lighthouse that needs one keeper. On paper, there is exactly one name in the system, mine, for this month. Someone else left in a rush. Their things are still here. Their handwriting is in the book. Their routines are baked into the place. Maybe the island doesn't really care whose name is on the schedule, as long as the duties are done. Maybe it built itself a pattern. 2 pairs of boots, 2 sets of steps, 1 presence to watch the other. Some days, reading the log, I'd find myself wondering whether I was the guest peeking in on someone else's established life, or the other way around. Whether the extra keeper was the one in front of the mirror, or the one glimpsed crossing the path. The thought that finally scared me enough to do something was simple. What if, to the station, we were both temporary? What if it was expecting one of us to leave? The monthly supply boat was due in 3 days when I made my decision. I'd woken to another night of footsteps, another morning of moved cups. The logbook had a new line in the neat hand. ROR 400. Woke, couldn't sleep, listened to wind, considered leaving early. I hadn't written that. I'd thought it. That was the last straw. I packed faster than I should have, shoving clothes into my duffel without folding. I did the minimum checks on the light, made sure the automatic systems were solid, and then sat on the low wall outside the cottage, bag at my feet, staring at the notch in the horizon where the boat would eventually appear. Behind me, boards creaked in the cottage. I didn't go back inside. At some point, I realized the logbook was still on the desk in the little alcove, waiting. Part of me itched to fetch it, to write a last line. Keeper departed, station secure. To close my chapter, cleanly. Another part imagined opening it and seeing that the sentence was already there, dated for an hour from now, in that other hand. So I stayed on the wall, eyes on the sea. The boat came, smaller than I remembered, cutting through the chop. The crew shouted greetings as if this were any other pickup. I hefted my bag, walked down the path, and didn't look at the cottage windows. On the ride back, one of the deckhands asked the usual question. So, how was it out there? Lonely. I thought about 2 pairs of boots by the door, about a cup moved half an inch, a jacket shifted hooks, about a version of my day written by someone with my habits but not my hesitation. Crowded, I said. Later, on shore, they asked if I wanted another remote posting. I said no. I stuck to harbor lights, busy channels, where you can always see at least 3 other people and a dozen moving vessels. But sometimes, when I'm filling out the logs at the end of a shift, my pen will catch on a word, as if it's following a groove already there. I'll look down and, just for a second, feel like I'm writing over someone else's sentence. Those are the nights I double-check that there's only 1 pair of boots by my door. Before you dismiss this as just another ghost tale, ask yourself how you'd react if a moving light started climbing toward your front door from sheer rock. I used to think I'd be the guy who stayed curious and calm, the rational one with the camera, right up until that lantern started working its way up the cliff toward the stairs outside my rented lighthouse. My name is Emery, and I went to Croatia for pictures, not for answers. The listing made it sound harmless. Old keeper's house beside historic lighthouse, perfect for photographers. I saw ruins, seascapes, maybe some moody star trails. What I got was a crumbling cottage clinging to a cliff, an abandoned tower whose lamp had been dead for years, and a set of stone steps that went down toward the sea and then just stopped. I arrived in the afternoon. The air smelled like salt and something older, baked into the stone. Moonlight would hit that place perfectly, I remember thinking. The house itself was barely furnished. Bed, table, a couple of chairs. But there was just enough electricity for my chargers, and just enough hot water to pretend it was a vacation. The first night, I set up in the yard between the cottage and the lighthouse. Old railings rusted along the cliff's edge, bent in places like something heavy had hit them long ago. Below, the rocks fell away in jagged teeth straight into the water. No beach, no path, just vertical stone and white foam. The sky cooperated. Thin cloud, bright moon, plenty of stars. I framed the broken tower against the sky, set the timer, and let the camera start its rhythm. Click, whir, pause. Click, whir, pause. Long exposure work means a lot of standing still, listening. The slow crash of waves. The faint clink from the dead lantern room when something shifted in the old glass. My own breath. That was when I noticed a glow on the rocks. It was small at first, down near the waterline. A warm, steady point of light where there should have been nothing but darkness and spray. It moved, swinging gently side to side, like a lantern hanging from someone's hand as they walked. But no one could walk there. The cliff face dropped straight down. The only way to the water on that side was to fall. I stepped closer to the rail, knuckles tight on the rusted metal, and squinted. The light kept moving along the base of the cliff, weaving in and out of shadow, never bobbing like a boat, never getting washed over by waves. It slid behind an outcrop, vanished, then reappeared a little further along, heading roughly toward the invisible line under my feet. My first instinct was the photographer's reflex, make it real by putting it on a screen. I shifted the tripod, widened the frame, and took another 30-second exposure with that part of the cliff dead center. When the preview popped up, my chest tightened. Rocks, water, tower, railings, all there. The spot where the lantern should have been was just empty darkness. I tried again. Different settings, different angle, nothing. The camera saw a blank cliff while my eyes watched a small, impossible light float where stone and sea met. I went inside earlier than I'd planned. That night, every noise felt amplified. The slow, patient boom of the waves far below. The occasional metallic tick from the lighthouse as it cooled. Something in the attic shifting like an old lens turning in its mount. I woke up more than once thinking I'd seen a faint glow through the cracked shutters, but each time it was just the afterimage of the moon. The next day, I asked about it. The woman at the little store in the village knew exactly which house I meant as soon as I mentioned the old lighthouse. Her expression tightened a little when I said I was staying there alone. "Cliff is not safe," she said. "Rock falls, no path." "Anybody fish under it at night?" I asked. "With lights? Boats?" She shook her head. "No boats there." Then, after a pause, "Sometimes people say they see something, but it is old story." "What kind of something?" I pressed. She looked past me at the door, like she was making sure no one else was listening. "Light," she said. "From when the tower worked. You don't follow it, that's all." I laughed because I didn't know what else to do. "I'm just taking pictures," I said. "Then take them from up top," she replied. "Not from the steps." Back at the house that evening, I told myself it was just local folklore. Every dangerous spot has a ghost story to keep kids away. Still, I couldn't pretend I wasn't waiting for the moment the light appeared again. It didn't make me wait long. This time, it showed up earlier, before the sky had gone completely dark. 1 minute, the cliff was just shadow on shadow. The next, there was that warm, swinging glow, tracing a path along rock no human should be able to stand on. It seemed higher than before, closer to the point where the stone steps ended in a broken platform halfway down. I tried the camera again, rapid shots this time, high ISO, short shutter, bracing the lens against the rail, In every image, the cliff was bare. Sometimes the area where the lantern should have been looked a little softer, like a smudge, but there was no actual light. Outside of the frame, it was bright enough that I could see the edges of rock around it. What bothered me most wasn't that I couldn't capture it. It was the way it seemed to respond when I moved. When I stepped back from the edge, the lantern paused. When I leaned out a little, it inched closer, not up or down, but toward the vertical line beneath my boots. That night, I heard it. Not the lantern itself. Light doesn't make sound, but something moving with it. Lying in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, I heard the slow crash of the waves rise and fall. Under that, a faint, irregular clink, like glass tapping against metal in a distant rhythm. It came from the direction of the tower. The dead lamp room was locked, but old buildings don't keep secrets from their own bones. The sound threaded through the house, gentle and insistent, as if someone were swinging a light back and forth over and over, each pass nudging the glass against its frame. I didn't go check. Instead, I lay there and tried to pretend it was just wind. By the third night, the just wind theory was hanging by a thread. I made the mistake of going down the stairs. Only a little. Just to the first landing, I told myself. Just far enough to look properly, to see if any kind of ledge existed that could explain what I'd been seeing. The stone steps were damp, grit under my boots. The drop to one side, a dark absence that made my stomach feel hollow. From that lower angle, the lantern looked closer than ever. It hung directly below the landing, maybe 15 or 20 feet down, in a place where there should have been only air. The rocks curved away underneath, leaving nothing for it to rest on, but it burned steadily, not flickering, not swaying as if on a rope. Its glow was warm, almost inviting. It didn't feel like moonlight or man-made electric light. It felt like the kind of light you get from old glass and oil. For a stupid second, I considered going one step lower, just to see if my perspective was wrong, just to see if maybe the cliff face bulged out in some way the drawings and photos hadn't shown. My toes edged forward on the stone. The lantern moved, not randomly, deliberately. It slid sideways, lining up with the center of the stairwell, directly under the point where someone would put their weight if they were trying to lean closer. I stepped back until my shoulders hit the rock behind me. The air felt thinner there, tight around my ribs. I raised the camera again, more out of reflex than hope, and fired off a few shaky shots. The shutter clicked, the little red light blinked, and when I checked the images, there was nothing but rock and black. I went back up the stairs, slowly, one hand flat against the wall. I didn't sleep much that night. At some point, I must have drifted because I woke to a glow pushing around the edges of the shutters, like water seeping under a door. It wasn't moonlight. Moonlight is gray, indifferent. This was yellow-orange, pulsing softly, moving from one window to the next. I sat up in bed, heart banging, and watched the strip of light crawl along the floorboards and stop outside my bedroom door. The little hairs on my arm stood up. There were no footsteps, no breathing, just that light, steady and patient, like someone had set a lantern down just on the other side of the thin wood and was waiting for me to open it. I didn't. After a while, I couldn't say how long, the glow shifted away. It swept once across the ceiling, then faded, leaving only the faint, familiar gray of distant waves and sky. At sunrise, I packed. The key went on the table. The chargers went in the bag. I walked out of the cottage without taking one last look over the edge, without one more just-in-case photo. On the drive back to the village, the lighthouse in my rearview mirror looked exactly like every romantic ruin I'd ever seen on postcards. The woman at the store didn't look surprised to see me a day early. "You're finished?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. The light came up the cliff. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded like that fit some private equation. "Some follow," she said quietly. "Some don't." "Where does it go?" I asked before I could stop myself. She shook her head. "Down," she said. Always down. Back home, far from that cliff, I went through the photos. Most were exactly what I'd wanted. Broken stone, clean stars, empty sea. In a few frames where I'd shot quickly from the stairs or the window, there were faint distortions at the edge of the image, like heat shimmer. In more than one, my own shadow leaned a little further over the drop than I remember standing. I tell myself, it's just the way long exposures stretch motion. I tell myself the lantern was some trick of refraction, some local atmospheric thing the villagers turned into a story. But sometimes, when I'm out at night now, shooting on safe ground, and I see a light where there shouldn't be one, a reflection, a car in the distance, a porch bulb flickering at the wrong time, I feel my feet wanting to move toward it on their own. That's when I pack up early and go home, and when someone online rolls their eyes at tales about cursed lights on rocks, I don't argue. I just ask them if they're absolutely sure that standing alone on a dark cliff with a warm, familiar glow beckoning them closer, they'd be the one who chose not to take that extra step. People say exhaustion makes you do strange things, but how do you explain perfect work logs you don't remember writing? That question didn't sound hypothetical anymore. The third time I woke up on the lantern room floor with my pen capped, my entries neat, and my legs shaking from a climb I couldn't recall. My name is Zalen, and I was sent to babysit a machine. Officially, I'm a technician for the Coastal Administration. Automation systems, diagnostics, that kind of thing. When they modernize old lighthouses, I'm one of the people they send out to make sure the new hardware doesn't quietly fail once everybody goes home. The job that started all of this was simple on paper. 4 nights at a newly automated tower on the Norwegian coast, 1 night watch package, run hourly checks, log readings, file a report. That was it. The lighthouse itself wasn't some romantic stone relic. It was a clean white cylinder with a compact LED array in the lantern, solar panels strapped to one side, and a stubby control room bolted on at the base like an afterthought. The Fresnel lens had been removed years before, carted to a museum. Inside, everything hummed with the bland, efficient sound of modern equipment. No ghosts, just firmware. It was early summer, which meant the sky never really went dark. Pale Arctic night, the brochure would call it. To me, it felt like someone had taken the day and just dialed the saturation down. The horizon stayed a washed-out blue-gray, the sea a restless sheet of metal. It should have made staying awake easier. It didn't. Night 1 started well enough. I set up in the small control room, a steel desk, a row of displays, and the new system's status lights in a neat line of green. A coffee machine hissed and grumbled in the corner, filling the air with the smell of burned beans and hot plastic. Overhead, modern LEDs buzzed softly, replacing whatever warm glow had once lived here with flat, flicker-free white. My instructions were clear. Every hour on the hour, climb to the lantern room, visually inspect the array and its housing, check 3 specific readouts from a panel up there, log them in the binder marked Night Watch Log 27B, then go back down, run a brief diagnostic in the control room, and repeat. For 4 nights. If everything behaved, I'd leave with a stack of boringly perfect numbers and a signed form. The first few rounds were almost pleasant. The stairs were metal and narrow, spiraling up inside the cylinder. Each step had the same soft clang. My flashlight wasn't strictly necessary. The windows along the stairwell leaked enough of the not-quite night to see by. But habit made me use it, the beam bouncing off brushed steel and pale paint. The lantern room door creaked when I opened it the first time. Someone had tried to fix the noise with oil and failed. LED panels ringed the top of the space like a crown of teeth, glowing a clinical white. The old glass panes had been replaced by something more utilitarian. The whole room smelled faintly of ozone and cleaning fluid, layered on top of older scents that refused to leave. Salt, rust, a lingering trace of fuel from the days when light came from flame. I checked the housing, noted the readouts, wrote them down in a binder that already had pre-printed headings. Time, voltage, load, notes. My handwriting on that first page was neat, almost cocky. "This is easy," it said. "You can do this half asleep." By the fourth round, that was no longer a joke. I've pulled plenty of late nights on server racks and equipment bays. There's a particular taste that creeps into your mouth when you push past a certain point. Metallic, like you've been biting a coin. The control room air, recycled and dry, made it worse. Strong coffee helped, and then didn't. The beeping of diagnostic equipment began to sound like a language I almost understood, vowels buried in error tones. Around 3 in the morning, I caught myself staring at the digital clock and realizing I had no memory of the 10 minutes before. My pen hovered over the log page with an unfinished 3 scrawled where the hour should go. I laughed, shook it off, did the round early to break the fog. I told myself I'd nap the next afternoon. So far, this is just a tired guy doing a repetitive job. It changed when the gaps in my memory stopped fitting inside my sense of time. On the second night, sometime between 2 and 4, the world jumped. I remember checking my watch at 2:05, standing up from the control room chair to stretch, blinking against the LED glare. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes on the floor of the lantern room. My cheek was pressed to cold metal. The overhead panels glowed too bright. My neck ached from being turned at an angle. For a second, I didn't know where I was. That moment of animal panic when the place doesn't match the last thing you saw. Then the rest snapped back. The job, the stairs, the watch. I pushed myself up, heart pounding, and looked around. Nothing was out of place. The LED array sat quietly in its housing. The readout panel blinked steady numbers. Outside the glass, the pale sea went on doing what it always did. The only evidence that anything had happened was the stiffness in my legs and the Night Watch Log 27B binder lying open on its stand. My latest entry, in my own hand, read, 0300 all values nominal, visual check OK. The time on my watch was 3:07. I touched the words with my fingers. The ink was dry. The letters leaned the way mine always did, a little forward, a little cramped. I did not remember writing them. There's a rational way to frame that. I could have spaced out. I could have performed the whole climb and check on autopilot, written the line, then sat down, just for a second, and nodded off. Memory gets patchy at the edges when you're sleep deprived. You can lose 5 minutes, 10, easy. But my body disagreed with that neat explanation. My thighs burned like I'd just come up the stairs in a hurry. My heart was still racing from what felt like exertion, not surprise. And there was the angle I'd been lying at. If I'd chosen a place to sit, I would have picked the bench against the wall, not the bare floor in the middle of the room. I went back down more carefully, counting each step like I needed proof that they were real. In the control room, I checked the security feed. One advantage of modern automation is that everything stares back at you. Cameras in the stairwell, in the lantern room, outside on the cliffside. It should have been easy to scroll back an hour and watch myself do whatever I'd done. On the screen, at 2:56, I saw myself stand up from the control room chair. I watched the version of me in the grainy footage walk to the door, open it, and step into the stairwell without hesitation. No stumble, no yawn, no sign of fighting sleep. The stairwell camera picked me up a moment later, head tilted slightly to one side, eyes half closed, moving with a smooth, almost mechanical pace up the steps. At no point did I glance at the camera, or at my watch, or at anything in my hands. The binder wasn't with me. It stayed in the lantern room. My arms hung loose at my sides. It looked like I'd been walking those stairs all my life. The lantern room camera showed me arrive at 2:59. I went straight to the panel, glanced once at the numbers, then turned to the log stand and wrote with quick, efficient strokes. I didn't pause to think. I finished the line, capped the pen, set it down exactly parallel to the edge of the binder. Then I stepped over to a patch of floor between the panel and the door, turned, and lay down. Not slid, not slumped. Lay down, first kneeling, then lowering myself carefully, like someone taking a deliberate nap. I folded one arm under my head, the other across my chest. After 30 seconds of total stillness, my face relaxed into the slack look of real sleep. Watching it, I felt a nausea that had nothing to do with motion. I hadn't chosen that. At least, not in any way my conscious mind remembered, but my body had carried out the pattern anyway. Climb, check, log, lie down. The routine done perfectly. The decision-making part of me apparently optional. I could have chalked it up to exhaustion. People sleepwalk. People do whole tasks in fugue states. The literature is full of it. But something about the precision of it, the exactness of the writing, the way I lay down in just the right spot to be in view of the camera, made it feel like more than a tired brain misfiring. Night 3 removed the could have. I tried to be clever. If the problem was fatigue, I'd manage the fatigue. I napped in the afternoon, set extra alarms, did stretches, drank water between coffees. When my shift started, I felt reasonably alert. Not fresh, but functional. For the first half of the night, nothing strange happened. I did the rounds, logged the values, tried not to stare at the clock. The LEDs buzzed, the equipment beeped, the outside world stayed dim and indifferent. Sometime after 2, the buzz of the lights started to blend with the hum of the generator below. The two sounds merged into a single, thick tone that wrapped around my thoughts like cotton. My eyes burned. The metallic taste in my mouth got stronger. I remember thinking, very clearly, I should stand up and walk around before I drift. Then I was back on the lantern room floor. This time, I was closer to the door. My shoulder touched the lower edge of the frame. My legs were angled in a way that would make it easy to roll and stand in one motion. The LEDs overhead felt like they were drilling into my skull. I forced myself upright, throat dry. Night Watch log 27B lay open where it always did. 0300, all values nominal, visual check OK. 0400, all values nominal, visual check OK. Both in my hand. Both in the same neat strokes. Both completely outside my memory. My watch said 4:06. I went cold all over. The rationalization engine spun up again. Maybe I really had spaced for an hour. Maybe the act of walking and writing had become such a well-worn groove that I could write it unconscious. But the more I tried to plug that in, the less it fit. There were other details too. The lantern room door, which I always pulled fully shut out of habit, hung just shy of closed, as if someone, or something, preferred it slightly ajar. The outside temperature readout on the panel showed a dip between 3 and 4 that hadn't been in the forecast. A brief cold pocket hugging the tower. Back in the control room, I checked the cameras again. The footage looked similar to the previous night, with one difference: my head. In the stairwell view, my head tilted further to the side, almost resting against the inner rail as I walked. My eyes were shut outright, not half open, not hooded, closed. In the lantern room feed, the way I moved was wrong. Not dramatic horror movie wrong, subtly wrong. The way a recording played at the wrong frame rate feels wrong. My movements lacked the little hesitations you don't notice until they're gone. No micro pauses while reading the panel. No small adjustments of grip on the pen. Just smooth, continuous motion. And when I turned toward the door after writing the 0400 entry, before I lay down, it looked like I was about to walk out. I froze the frame on that moment. My hand hovered inches from the handle. My head was still tilted, my eyes still shut, but my body language was unmistakable, forward, intent. As if some part of me that wasn't mine had just remembered that, beyond that door, there was another set of stairs. And beyond those, a cliff. I scrubbed the footage forward. In the next instant, I stopped, turned away, and lay down on the floor instead. Something had interrupted. I didn't know what. Maybe the angle of the tower against the wind. Maybe some small noise my deeper brain cared about. Maybe nothing at all. Whatever it was, it had changed the script. The realization that there might be a script at all made the room feel smaller. I made it through the rest of the night by brute force. I paced. I spoke out loud just to hear a human voice. I slapped my own face more times than I'd admit. Every hour, when the time came to climb, I brought the binder with me instead of leaving it upstairs just to break the pattern. My entries from that stretch are messy. Times underlined, numbers double-checked, notes like, "Remember this," scrawled in the margin. I didn't wake up on the floor again. I barely slept at all. The morning felt like being let out of a tight box. I seriously considered calling the whole thing in. There are safety protocols for compromised alertness. I could have cited fatigue, demanded relief, flagged the job as needing a second person. But pride is a stupid thing, and so is not wanting to be the technician who can't hack 4 nights of monotony. They were counting on me to get clean data on the automation system. That's what I told myself. I'd do one more night, then I'd leave and sleep for a week. Night 4 made the decision for me. It started the same as the others. Sun that never really set, sliding sideways around the horizon, painting the sea with dull light. Status lights green, coffee bitter, air stale. By then, I was so tired that my own thoughts didn't sound like mine all the time. They came with a delay, echoing back from somewhere farther away than my skull. Keeping my eyes open felt like pulling on ropes. "I'm not going to the floor tonight," I said out loud as the clock crept toward 2. Saying it made it feel almost like a promise to someone. I added a physical barrier. I dragged a chair into the lantern room and wedged it between the panel and the door, forcing myself to step around it to reach the handle. Break the routine, change the choreography. The first 2 climbs passed in a jittery blur. My entries at 100 and 200 were shaky but conscious. The air in the lantern room felt cooler than below, a thin, high cold that raised goosebumps on my arms. At air 245, I made a mistake. I sat down in the control room chair just for a minute to rest my legs. I set the alarm on my watch for 5 minutes as insurance. I remember staring at the second hand sweeping around, then blinking. The alarm never went off. Or if it did, I didn't remember hearing it, because the next sensation was of my shoulder hitting something hard. I woke halfway up the stairs, my body already moving. My face was inches from the inner rail, cheek brushing cold metal every few steps as I swayed. My hand gripped the outer rail with a strength my conscious mind wasn't controlling. My feet landed with eerie precision, perfectly centered on each narrow tread. My eyes, I realized with a jolt, were shut. The shock of awareness hit so hard I nearly lost my footing. I grabbed both rails and forced my eyes open. For a heartbeat, the world snapped into focus. The curve of the stairwell, the pale light leaking through the small windows, the taste of that weird, metallic exhaustion on my tongue. Above me, the lantern room door stood slightly open, 2 fingers' width, the gap like a watching eye. I hadn't left it that way. Everything in my body wanted to keep moving, to complete whatever loop I'd been running in my sleep. It would have been so easy to let go, to ride the pattern, door, panel, binder, door again. Instead, I stopped. Not just physically. I forced myself to stand there on that step and do nothing at all for a full 60 seconds. I counted them out loud. 1, 2, 3. My voice sounded thin, but it was mine. By 60, my legs were shaking with the effort of resisting a motion I hadn't chosen in the first place. When I finally climbed the rest of the way, I pushed the door open with my shoulder, keeping both hands on the frame. The chair I'd wedged between the panel and the door was no longer there. It sat neatly back where it belonged, against the wall. Night Watch Log 27B lay open on the stand. My pen rested beside it, cap off. There was a fresh entry. 0300, all values nominal, visual check okay. I checked my watch. 3:01. The numbers on the panel matched what I'd written, even though I hadn't looked at them yet. The time, the voltage, the load, correct. The notes box held a single word. Clear. Something icy slid down my spine. I didn't check the cameras that time. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I did something I probably should have done earlier but had been avoiding out of stubbornness. I opened the outside door at the base of the tower and stepped out onto the path that led to the cliff. The air hit me like a different world. Cool, damp, real. The pale sky stretched over a sea that never stopped moving. Rocks jutted out below like knuckles. The lighthouse cast a thin shadow. The ground between the edge of the cliff and the tower steps was a short strip of gravel and grass, hardened by years of boots. That morning, it held something else. Footprints. They led from the edge of the cliff to the base of the stairs. Not to the door, not away from the tower. Toward it. Bare, by the look of them. Narrow, human, darker where the ground was damp. They started in a place where there shouldn't have been solid earth underfoot, just a little shy of where the drop began, and ended at the bottom step like whoever had made them had simply stopped. They were fresh. The edges were still sharp. Water had pooled in the deepest parts of the prints, as if whoever had left them had come up from the sea itself. A colder kind of fatigue settled over me then. The pattern in the tower, the perfect entries, the way my body had been moving without me. It all felt like a loop trying to close. And now there was this other loop, footprints from nowhere to my door. Whatever was bored or hungry or lonely enough to latch onto the only human habit in its range had found me. I went back inside, shut the door, and leaned my back against it until my breathing slowed. Then I took Night Watch Log 27B off its stand, walked it down to the control room, and set it beside the terminal. I called my coordinator. "I'm done," I said before he could get through his greeting. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. 4 nights is enough. The system's fine. I'm not staying another one. There was a pause, then some questions about data, about procedure. I answered them automatically like entries in a form. I did not mention waking up on the floor. I did not mention the security footage. I did not mention the footprints. "How are you holding up?" he asked at the end, in the token human part of the conversation. "I'm tired," I said, "and I think that's when mistakes get made." He accepted that. Maybe he heard something in my tone. Maybe he'd heard it before from other techs who'd done nights in automated towers that still held the ghosts of routines. They flew someone else out the next day to relieve me. I handed over the digital reports, the neat stack of paper logs, the binder with its tidy columns of flawless checks. Night Watch Log 27B looked exactly like a training example. No gaps, no anomalies, no drama. "Everything green?" the new tech asked, flipping through it. "Yeah," I said. "Everything's green." He nodded, satisfied, and went to do his first round. He walked up the stairs with the easy stride of someone who hadn't yet had to wonder if his feet were moving by choice. I left with my bag over my shoulder, and that metallic taste still in the back of my throat. At home, my sleep schedule eventually reset. The buzzing of LEDs faded into the background of other jobs. The metallic tang went away. But some nights, when I'm up too late in a control room somewhere else, watching flat green lines and listening to machines breathe, I feel my head start to tilt and my eyes want to close. That's when I stand up. I walk. I deliberately break whatever pattern I've fallen into. I leave forms half-filled until I'm sure I'm the one writing them, and I don't keep paper logs on night shifts anymore. Not because I'm afraid of what I'll see on the page, but because I'm afraid of how perfect those pages might look in the morning, filled with my own neat handwriting, describing a night I don't remember living at all. When your kid starts repeating words from records you've never opened, at what point do you stop calling it a phase and start listening? I used to think I'd always be the calm, rational parent in the room, until my daughter started talking about the other family that still lives upstairs in our Lighthouse house. My name is Skyla, and for one summer, I was the part-time caretaker of a historic lighthouse off the coast of North Carolina. The Park Service made it sound like a dream gig: free housing in the attached keeper's cottage, a stipend for basic maintenance and opening up for tours, and plenty of downtime when the last ferry left and the island went quiet. I pictured warm evenings on the porch, my partner reading, my kid running around in the yard with a plastic bucket collecting shells. Most of that came true for the first week. Daytime, the place felt almost too cheerful to ever be haunted. Ferry crowds in flip-flops and sunglasses shuffled up the path, kids racing each other to see who could reach the base of the tower first. The entry hall smelled like sunscreen and old wood. Faded black and white photos of grim mustached men and stiff-backed women lined the walls, each with a little plaque. Keeper so-and-so, year such and such, storm damage here, rebuilding there. We'd take groups up the iron stairs, me doing the little spiel about Fresnel lenses and ship lanes, my kids sitting cross-legged at the bottom of the stairwell playing with toy cars or a doll. By late afternoon, the last tour would leave. The final boat's horn would echo across the water, and the whole island would exhale. That's when it stopped feeling like a museum and started feeling like someone's house again. The first time my daughter mentioned the other family, we were picking up toys from the base of the tower. It was one of those heavy evenings where the air doesn't move, and thunder rumbles so far away, you feel it more than hear it. She was lining her figures up on the first step to watch for storms, as she put it. I told her it was time to put them away and get ready for bed. But they'll miss it, she said. Who will? The other boy, the one who has to stay upstairs. It took me a second to process that. You mean the kid from the picture, I guessed, thinking of the old photograph in the hall of a keeper's family. Parents in their best clothes, a little boy in short pants staring stiffly at the camera. She shook her head. No, not him. The one that lives up there now. Kids say weird stuff all the time. I was ready with the standard, "Oh yeah?" and a gentle redirect. But something in her tone, not scared, just matter of fact, made me ask, "What's his name?" She frowned the way she does when she's thinking hard. He says he forgot, she answered. His dad just calls him boy when he's mad. A chill walked up my spine, but I shrugged it off. Well, our boy needs to brush his teeth, I said, and she laughed and followed me down the hall. That night, after she was asleep, I stood in the entry hall longer than usual, looking at the old photos. Families that had lived here when hurricanes didn't have nice short names and weather reports came too late. There were little boys in a lot of those pictures. None of them looked particularly happy. The second time she brought it up, she had details. We were in the kitchen, storm outside pressing against the old windows. The forecast said it was just a strong thunderstorm, nothing serious, but the wind had a way of threading through the gaps and making the whole cottage feel like a ship. The lights flickered once, then steadied. My partner and I exchanged a glance. We'd been told the generator would kick in if the power went, but it was still a little unnerving. You don't have to worry, my daughter said suddenly, from her spot on the floor with crayons. The light doesn't go out in storms. His dad makes him go up and make sure. I looked down at her. Whose dad? The other boy's, she said, as if we'd been talking about him all along. He's not allowed to leave the tower when the big storms come. They have to sleep up there, on the rope bed. I felt my mouth go dry. Where did you hear that? She shrugged, coloring the sea in violent streaks of blue. He told me. He likes when there's thunder. He said he can hear it in the glass. My partner raised an eyebrow at me. We'd both read the basic info packet they'd given us. Dates, renovation details, a cheerful paragraph about braving storms in centuries past. Nothing that specific. Nothing about rope beds or rules. That's quite a story, my partner said gently. You have a good imagination. My daughter gave them a look full of 5-year-old disdain. It's not a story, she said. He lives here. That night, after she was asleep, I went digging. The small office behind the entry hall held the usual. Maintenance logs, emergency numbers, brochures. In a low cabinet, I found a battered binder labeled Historical Records, Staff Use Only. Inside, photocopied newspaper clippings and typed summaries told more detailed stories than the glossy pamphlets. It didn't take long to find the one that made my stomach twist. 100 years ago, a hurricane had sat over the island for 2 days. The keeper at the time had moved his family into the lantern room for safety when the water started to come up the hill. The report, written in the dry language of the era, mentioned an old rope cot, where the children slept between shifts tending the light by hand when the mechanism jammed. The part about what happened after was smudged, but one line stood out. The youngest boy was found clinging to the gallery rail the next morning, the remains of his father nearby. I closed the binder and stared at the door to the tower, the iron, stairs on the other side invisible but suddenly very present. I hadn't mentioned rope cots in front of my daughter. Neither had any of the tour signs. The word hadn't come up in any of the child-friendly exhibits. I told myself she'd overheard a ranger talking to another adult. The mind grabs what it hears and replays it in new ways. The next day was bright and hot, the storm blown out to sea. Tourists came back in cheerful waves. My daughter trotted along beside me on the first tour, pointing out the big light with pride. The phrase, "other family," didn't come up once. By evening, I'd convinced myself the whole thing was just coincidence. Then hurricane season stopped being a theoretical thing in the binder. The forecast started talking about a bigger storm. Not a monster, but serious enough that the Park Service began contingency planning. The island would be closed to visitors 2 days before landfall. Staff could evacuate or shelter in place, depending on the track. We debated it. The house was solid. The tower had been through worse. Leaving meant trying to get 3 ferries and a long drive ahead of half the coast. Staying meant trusting a structure older than all of us. "When will the water come up the hill?" my daughter asked over dinner that night, more curious than afraid. "Hopefully it won't," I said. "It did last time," she said. "It came all the way to the porch. That's why they had to go upstairs." "Who told you that?" I asked, even though I already knew what she was going to say. She put down her fork. "The boy," she said patiently. "He said we should sleep where they did. Otherwise the water will get in the windows when the glass breaks." I felt my partner's eyes on me, felt the thin line we were balancing on between indulging a kid's elaborate imaginary friend and taking a warning seriously. "We're not camping in the lantern room," my partner said, trying to keep their tone light. "It's not child-safe up there." "He said if we don't, you'll get mad and try to leave," she replied, looking straight at them. "And then you won't come back." The room felt suddenly too warm. After we put her to bed, we talked in low voices in the kitchen, the hum of the fridge and the distant hiss of the ocean underlining every word. She could have heard bits from tourists, my partner said, running a hand through their hair. People tell storm stories on tours all the time. She used the phrase, "rope bed," before I found that file, I said, and now she's quoting things from records I haven't opened yet. "Are you saying you believe there's a ghost kid giving your daughter survival tips?" I didn't have a good answer. I knew only that the line between cute, creepy kid stuff and "we should maybe adjust our plans" had been quietly crossed. When the Park Service called the next morning with the updated track, storm stronger, coming faster, ferry schedule uncertain, we had to decide. They gave us the option to evacuate that day on the last guaranteed boat or to stay as official storm monitors, with hazard pay and the promise of priority pickup after. Rationally, the safe option was obvious. Get out now. Avoid being stranded. My daughter watched us from the doorway, hugging her stuffed animal. "He says you'll try to go," she told me later on the porch, while my partner was on the phone confirming our choice. "What do you mean?" I asked. "He says his mom and dad said they might go too, but then his dad got mad about the boat people and said, 'We'll ride it out. We always have.'" She mimicked an adult tone scarily well. "And what happened?" I asked, throat tight. She shrugged. "He doesn't like that part. He just says we have to stay with the light." In the end, we did something that would make half the people I know call us irresponsible and the other half call us brave. We stayed. but we decided to do it on our terms. We prepped the cottage as best we could, boarded lower windows, secured loose things in the yard, checked the generator. We moved a mattress into the hallway away from glass. We packed go bags in case things got bad. And, as a compromise I still can't fully explain, we set up a small camp in the lantern room as well. Not a full move-in, not like the description in the old report. Just a rope-bottom cot from storage, a couple of blankets, flashlights, extra water. For a drill, I told myself. For options. My daughter watched us carry things up the spiral stairs with a seriousness far beyond her years. "He says thank you," she whispered as we laid the blanket down. The storm came in overnight like a slow grinding machine. Wind built in layers. First a restless rustle in the trees, then a steady push against the walls, then the full-body shove that made the glass in the cottage windows shudder. The sky turned the sick color it gets before things break. Thunder moved closer, its rumble rolling through the tower like a freight train. Downstairs, the cottage popped and complained. Upstairs, in the lantern room, the sound was different. The wind didn't just hit the walls, it wrapped the glass, whistling and moaning in the narrow spaces between panes. Rain slashed across in diagonal sheets. The old rope cot creaked when I sat on it, the smell of salt and dust rising with each shift. We started the night in the hallway, all three of us on the mattress listening. When the power blinked out for the first time and the generator roared awake, my daughter sat up. "It's time to go," she said. "To the tower?" I asked. She nodded. "He says the windows will break down here." Almost on cue, a branch hit the side of the cottage with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Glass tinkled somewhere in a back room. We grabbed our bags and went up. Climbing the iron stairs in a storm feels like walking up into the throat of something alive. The metal vibrated under our feet. The air temperature dropped with each turn. By the time we reached the lantern room, my fingers were numb on the rail. Inside, the world became noise and light. The lamp itself had been modernized, its beams steady and indifferent. But everything around it was still old. Old glass, old frames, old tiny gaps that let the storm's voice in. Thunder boomed so close it felt inside my bones. Lightning strobed the sea into a flat white disk, horizon gone. We settled on and around the cot, my daughter between us, clutching her stuffed animal. She seemed more curious than afraid, eyes wide, scanning the room like she was expecting someone else to step out from behind the central column. "Is he here?" I whispered, not sure who I was asking. "He doesn't like when it's this loud," she whispered back. "He says this is the part when his dad gets angry." The beams swept. Wind howled. Somewhere below, something heavy banged against the side of the tower over and over, like a loose shutter or a piece of debris trying to find a way in. Hours blurred. We dozed in snatches, jerked awake by particularly bad gusts. At some point, the radio crackled with a check-in from the mainland. Our voices tight as we confirmed we were still intact. They told us the worst would pass before dawn. Sometime around whatever passed for 3 in that murk, my daughter sat up very straight. "We can't let him go out," she said urgently. "Who?" I asked, heart already speeding up even before she pointed. Her finger aimed at the gallery door, the narrow exit to the balcony that ringed the lantern room. "He thinks he has to check the rail," she said. "That's when it happened last time." The door was latched. We'd made sure of it. But as we watched, it shivered in its frame, just a little, like someone on the other side had put their weight against it. A memory surfaced. The smudged line in the old report about the boy found clinging to the rail, the remains of his father nearby. Lightning flashed, turning the door handle into a bright, brief thing. For the first time since we came up, I felt like we weren't alone. Not in the nice, shared experience way, but in the someone else has their hand on the metal way. My partner moved before I could, crossing the room and bracing their back against the door. The latch rattled once, hard enough to make the hinges squeal. My daughter clapped her hands over her ears. "No," my partner said out loud, to whoever or whatever was on the other side. "Nobody goes out." For a few long seconds, the pressure stayed. Then slowly, it eased. The rest of the night passed in a kind of focused haze. No more door rattles, just wind and water and the endless, patient sweep of the light. By dawn, the worst of it had moved on. The sea was still angry, but the sky had started to lighten in streaks of bruised pink. We went down to assess the damage. Several cottage windows had cracked or blown out, just as the boy, had implied. A tree branch had speared one of the porch posts. Debris littered the path, but the tower stood solid. The lantern room glass had held. On the gallery, when we finally opened the door, the rail was slick with rain and salt. I had to fight the urge to grip it extra hard, as if honoring the ghost of a child who hadn't been so lucky. My daughter walked out between us, looked at the horizon, and smiled. "He's happy," she said. "He says we listened." We left the island at the end of our contract with thank yous and handshakes and a promise to come back as visitors someday. I returned the binder to its cabinet, closed the door to the tower, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that, in the end, when things got bad, we'd followed advice from a kid who died a century ago. Back home, far from hurricanes and lighthouse stares, life slid back into school runs and grocery lists. Every now and then, though, a storm rolls through our neighborhood, and thunder makes the windows buzz. When it does, my daughter will sometimes glance toward the sky with a particular expression. Listening, like she's catching the end of a sentence spoken in another room. I don't ask her what she hears, but when she tells me we should sleep in the hallway instead of the bedroom, just in case, I move the pillows without arguing. And if she ever says, in that calm, matter-of-fact voice, that we need to go upstairs and stay with the light, I know exactly which part of that old summer I'll be remembering.